And hello to everyone. I'm Mike Martinego of SportMedBC. We're so glad you could join us for our first SportMed Safety Webinar of 2014. We'll be doing a series of 8 webinars beginning today, taking us through to early 2015, and we're so glad that you could join us for this webinar on shoulder injuries, an injury that has affected many athletes, whether it's contact sports, I'm sure running. Our first webinar, 2014, as mentioned, best practices, shoulder injuries. And just before I throw it over to our manager of SportMed Safety and Event Services, Paul Dwyer, I do want to mention that if you have any questions or comments, any feedback, we'll try our best to answer it throughout the webinar. There's a toolbar on the right-hand side of the screen that allows you to send us questions and comments. As well, this webinar will be posted in our safety network and our YouTube channel, and it'll be on the homepage of SportMedBC.com within the next 48 hours, most likely within the next couple hours, in fact. So be sure to sign up for the free safety network. Check out the webinar, again, online, SportMedBC.com, in case you missed anything. For now, I'll pass it over to our manager of SportMed Safety and Event Services, Paul Dwyer, and Paul will take us through best practices, shoulder injuries.
Thanks to Mike, and thank you to everybody joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to presenting on shoulder injuries. So as Mike said, I'm the Manager of Sports Safety and Event Services with SportMedBC, and my background is as a certified athletic therapist and a certified strength and conditioning specialist. Within that field, we see a lot of shoulder injuries, and it's evident that it's prominent not only for athletes, but also people in the general public. Typically, people are pretty lucky if they don't experience a shoulder injury in their athletic career, as well as in their activities of daily life. So let's dive right into it. Okay, so we're going to look at our agenda today as understanding the shoulder joint. We're going to take a quick anatomical look at the shoulder joint, looking at the joints of the shoulder, the muscles of the shoulder. Then we'll dive into some really common injuries related to the shoulder, as well as some injury prevention tips and some tips for strengthening and stretching the shoulder. So the shoulder is a really complex joint involving actually 3 separate joints. It's freely movable, one of the most mobile joints in the entire body. It has a huge range of motion, allowing us to move in multiple directions, multiple planes of movement, and with that it gives us a lot of enhancement with using our extremities. It allows, like what this picture shows, these pitchers to throw in excess of 90 to 100 miles an hour. It allows us to have our arm in space catching projectiles. It allows us to balance our whole body, hang our whole body. So it's a really dynamic joint. But all this mobility also can lead to a lot of instability in the joint. So we're dive right into looking at the joint specifically. So as I mentioned, the joints of the shoulder involve actually 3 joints. So if you follow my cursor here, we're going to start with the sternoclavicular joint. Then we'll take a look at the acromioclavicular joint, and then lastly the glenohumeral joint. And you see I've written here the scapular thoracic joint as well. It's not a true joint, but we will briefly discuss that as well. So the sternoclavicular joint, this is the only bony connection of the arm to the axial skeleton. So what we're looking at here in this picture is the front view of the connection of your clavicle to your sternum, so your sternum being that central bone along your chest cavity. Okay, so this is a really stable joint, and that's partially because of its location at the central part of your body. The connecting points are this central bone here, the manubrium of the sternum bone, okay, and the clavicle, which is also referred to commonly as the collarbone. So in between here, you'll see on the other side with the cartilage taken away, there's also a disc that helps with absorption and gliding within that joint. And this is reinforced by a capsule, so a cartilaginous capsule that surrounds the joint, as well as ligaments and as well as muscles surrounding the joint. So really it's a stable joint in the shoulder that allows for movement between the clavicle and the main part of your chest cavity, the sternum. The acromioclavicular joint is the next joint we're going to look at, and this is a gliding plane joint. So the view you've got here is actually the front view of the scapula, the humerus, and the associated connection points between the acromion, which is a piece of the scapula, and the lateral side of the clavicle. So this is the joint right here. Okay, these joints are very, very commonly sprained, really susceptible to injury. And it consists, like I said, between the lateral end of the clavicle and just sort of this medial side of the acromion, which is a piece of the scapula. And again, this is reinforced by a capsule as well, and it's also supported by sort of three main ligaments: the superior ligament here, the acromioclavicular ligament, and these two ligaments here, the trapezoid ligament and the conoid ligament. The next joint we're looking at is the glenohumeral joint. Now this is the main shoulder joint that people think of, the ball and socket joint. This is the most mobile joint in the body, so with it being very mobile, it's also very susceptible to injury. So it's a ball and socket joint, the ball being at the head of the humerus, this round convex shaped bone here, and it articulates or joins with the shoulder blade and a piece of that projects out called the glenoid fossa, and that's a concave projection that points towards the head of the humerus. Okay, so this is what it looks like, obviously with all the ligaments and muscles away from it, and this is what we're looking at, this joint here with a reinforced capsule and ligaments. And this this joint is also very much supported by the musculature surrounding it. And I've written here the rotator cuff. We always hear about rotator cuff injuries, and we'll get into how they're associated with the glenohumeral joint. And lastly, the scapulothoracic joint. So this isn't necessarily a true articulation between bones, but it refers more to how the scapula rests on the thoracic cage or the rib cage, and its function is really dependent upon the integrity of the other joints in the body, the SC joint, the AC joint, and the GH joint of the shoulder, and as well as muscle function associated around the scapula. The muscles of the shoulder joint. So we want to look first at the rotator cuff muscles. We hear lots about injuries to the rotator cuff. I commonly hear people say, oh, I tore my rotator cuff. I've got a rotator cuff injury. So the rotator cuff actually consists of four muscles, four tiny but very, very, very important muscles in terms of how the shoulder functions. So these muscles function to hold the head of the humerus into that glenoid fossa on the scapula, and they help to perform rotational movements of the humerus, so that upper part of the arm. So if you imagine turning your arm inwards and outwards, it's those tiny muscles of the rotator cuff that help to do that, as well as help to keep that ball in the socket. Okay, so I'm just going to use the cursor here to point out the different muscles. So this here on the right is your back view. So this shoulder blade, the upper part, we've got the supraspinatus tendon or muscle. So as you can imagine, it comes underneath the clavicle and helps to pull the arm upwards when this muscle shortens. And then we've got the infraspinatus muscle, which is below the spine of the scapula, and that helps to turn the arm outwards. And we've got the teres minor muscle that also helps to turn the arm outwards or externally rotate it. On the left here, we've got the anterior view, and we're looking at the subscapularis muscle. So this muscle is along the inner border of the scapula, and it'll actually help to turn the arm inwards or inwardly rotate or internally rotate the arm. Okay. Now, if we wanted to get into all the muscles of the shoulder, we could be here for another 45-minute lecture, but I'm briefly just going to point out some of the major muscles involved. The pectoralis muscles, the trapezius muscles, the latissimus dorsi, the biceps brachii, the triceps. Lots of muscles associated with the shoulder, how it moves, how it operates. Okay, let's dive into some of the shoulder injuries here. We're going to start off with fractures. Okay, so commonly fractured bones associated with the shoulder are the clavicle. So this is really susceptible due to its S-shaped curve as well as its proximity to the skin. And it's often hit with direct trauma through body contact and through direct falls onto an outstretched arm. Very common, and you can see here the left clavicle of this individual is broken. So with that, there becomes a lot of complications or potential complications due to the associated nerves and vasculature that's surrounding the clavicle. Next, there's the humerus. So this is often broken around the surgical neck, and this is this thin portion just below the round portion of the humerus. With young athletes, you often see fractures within the round part at the growth plate of the humerus, so up in this portion here, and that's often from overuse. You see it quite often with young overhead throwing athletes. And the mechanism can be similar to the clavicle with falling on an outstretched arm. And then lastly, I don't have a picture of it, but the scapula, it's a lot less commonly injured. Typically with fractures, your healing time is approximately 6 to 8 weeks, and like I said, there could be complications to the vasculature surrounding the shoulder as well as the nerves that surround the shoulder. Sprains. So common sprains are mainly to the AC joint and the GH joint. The SC joint can be sprained again from falling on an outstretched hand, but less likely because it is so stable in comparison to the others. The separated shoulders you often hear of is the acromioclavicular joint sprain. So it's graded based on the severity. Grade 1 being just a minor tear to the superior AC joint. Grade 2 involving almost a full tear of the AC joint and partial of the conoid and trapezoid ligaments, and grade 3 being a full tear of all ligaments, which often requires surgery. And the GH joint sprain down below involves forceful movements that draw the round part of the bone, the humerus, out of that socket, pressuring the ligaments along the front. So it often is a case of an anterior movement of the bone, and that can be caused again through forceful excessive movements. And like I said, most oftenly it is going to dislocate anteriorly. So treatments for this are going to involve staying immobilized for the first portion, potentially surgical intervention, rehabilitation, and strengthening of all the muscular associated. Dislocations, again, they're similar to what's going to happen with the separations or the ligament sprains, and it's essentially when bones are displaced from their normal position within the joint. An AC joint separation, as we talked about, is when the ligaments are actually broken to the point where the bones become displaced from their normal articulation. The GH joint dislocation can happen anteriorly, posteriorly, and inferiorly, depending on the mode or the mechanism of the injury. Labral tears. The labrum is essentially another form of cartilage that is attached to the rim of the glenoid fossa in this portion right here, and it's continuous with the glenohumeral ligaments. Okay, it helps to deepen that joint space and hold the head of the humerus in that joint. So causes can be overuse, and they can also be just acute trauma, and it often will involve other structures, including the rotator cuff tendons, the long head of the biceps tendon, as well as the GH ligaments. Treatment for the labral tear is really dependent on how severe the tear is, how much is torn, and how much pain and function are associated with the shoulder joint. Muscle strains and tears, something that a lot of people have experienced a lot of the time with the lower part of the body. It happens a lot with the shoulder when there's excessive overuse over time, or when there's too much of a sudden overload on the muscle. And this is essentially a damage to the integrity of the muscle fiber of the tendon, and it can happen within the belly of the muscle or within the tendon itself. When somebody experiences a tear, dependent on the severity, treatment will involve icing for pain and for swelling, immobilization, and then once rehabilitation starts, progressive strengthening and correcting poor mechanics. And as I said, it may require surgery if the tear is too severe. Tendinitis is an inflammation of the actual tendon of the muscle. And again, this can come from a really acute or sudden overload, and often from an eccentric contraction. So if you imagine two types of muscle contractions, a concentric muscle contraction would involve a shortening of the muscle, and an eccentric would be a lengthening of the muscle. So, if a muscle is taken to too long a length, often there'll be a forceful eccentric contraction to try and shorten that muscle and keep it from moving, or the joint from moving to an excessive range of motion. So often tendons are injured in that respect. Again, the initial treatment will be rest, address any issues that need to be corrected in terms of biomechanics, and then the main thing to getting that strength back is strengthening the muscle eccentrically. The impingement is a compression of the supraspinatus tendon, the subacromial bursa, or a fat pad that the tendon runs over, as well as the biceps tendon. Decreased space here leads to compression and friction, and it's really common in overhead sports, and that'll lead to pain, loss of strength, and inflammation in the tendon itself, making it really difficult for people to do any activities that involve lifting the arm. So some of the tips we want to talk about in terms of injury prevention are essentially geared towards looking at if there are any existing mechanical deficits or postural deficits or strength deficits first. And then we're going to look at choosing safe equipment, ensuring safe training techniques, and full range of motion, and balancing your muscles. Okay? Functional and orthopedic assessments can really help to point out any problems that you may have in terms of muscle imbalances, joint misalignment, postural problems, and this can be done through a registered physiotherapist, certified athletic therapist, or kinesiologist. With the assessment, you may get some corrective strengthening techniques or stretching techniques to help correct any pre-existing problems. Coaches, biomechanists, kinesiologists, athletic therapists, and physiotherapists can help to point you in the direction of if you have poor mechanics that are potentially putting your shoulder joint at stress. They'll teach you to use full body movements rather than put all the force through the shoulder joint, and focus on your technique before you're focusing on building strength and speed in your sport. Another important factor is choosing the right equipment. Use equipment that meets standards so that you're safe within your sport. Choose the proper equipment for your size. So that involves using a tennis racket that's the right size for a child, throwing the right distances for a child. Using the equipment that's the best for your size and for your sport are going to reduce injuries. Some of the training techniques are to involve doing a really good proper warm-up. The warm-up is meant to warm your body, increase your breathing rate and heart rate, and help to activate your muscular system and get you ready for your sport. Before you get into sport, a dynamic, sport-specific type of warm-up is the most important thing for getting prepared for the sport. Start off with broad, small movements like rotating the shoulders, working up to more fast, sport-specific movements for whatever your sport might be. After activity, you want to get into specific, slow, static stretching that's going to help re-lengthen the muscles and relax the muscles. As I mentioned before, making sure you have a full range of motion is key to staying safe in sport. Generally speaking, if you can lift your arm straight up in front flexion or straight up to the side in abduction with 180 degrees of range of motion without pain, that's a good sign. One of the most important things that I see with rehabbing shoulder injuries is an imbalance between the small muscles that support your scapula as well as the large muscles. A lot of the time you see people focus on those big, powerful muscles without paying attention to the little ones. So the scapular muscles help to stabilize all of those movements with the shoulder blade. So it's really important to focus on those rotator cuff muscles as well as the small postural muscles, those rhomboid muscles in the back of the shoulder blades, okay, and the trapezius muscles, as well as some of the smaller muscles in the front that are going to help to stabilize the shoulder joint. As I mentioned before, stretching. Prior to practice, dynamic movements. After practice, these slow, isolated, static stretches. You want to focus on specific muscle groups, and typically a guideline would be 3 sets of 20 to 30 seconds for each specific stretch. I'm just going to touch on a few strengthening exercises that might help to guide you in making sure you're balancing small and large muscles. The rotator cuff muscles, like I said, are extremely important for stabilization of the scapula. You can use any of these tools to strengthen the muscle using these rotational exercises. TheraBands, weighted balls, dumbbells, and cable machines all can facilitate these internal and external rotation exercises. Make sure to balance between back muscles. So posterior muscles are important. We're constantly doing sports that are in a frontal plane, pushing things, moving forwards. We want to make sure that we strengthen those posterior muscles to keep the scapulas or the shoulder blades closer together and moving smoothly against the rib cage. So those muscles are the trapezius and the rhomboids. You'll see a few muscles here, or a few exercises here that'll help to strengthen the posterior chain. And then you've got your anterior muscles, the pectoralis and the serratus anterior muscles. Obviously these are stronger muscles, so you want to balance between the posterior and the anterior. And lastly, it's really important that you focus your strengthening on sport-specific simulated movements. Okay? Less repetitions with greater intensity. You want to prepare your shoulder joint for those rapid, powerful movements that involve a rapid stretch and then shortening into a concentric range of motion. Okay, so you'll see on the side here some extreme plyometric exercises that focus on strengthening the shoulder joint. So to summarize, the shoulder joint is a very complex joint with a lot of mobility, and thus it's susceptible to injury. Injury prevention is really just about preparing yourself properly before competition and making sure that you train small and large muscles. Naturally, you don't want to overdo it and go too far, and always listen to your body. I want to thank you very much for joining us. My name's Paul Dwyer. If you want to reach me, you can see my contact information here, and I look forward to talking to you again in our future webinars. I'll pass it back to Mike.
Excellent stuff. Thanks again, Paul, and thanks again to everyone for tuning in and passing along their thoughts. Again, for tips and for various tools, resources, information on workshops, be sure to visit SportMedBC.com. Mentioned it earlier that the webinar will be posted online within the next 48 hours, but we'll aim to get it up even sooner than that. Paul mentioned how to contact him for more information. Definitely check out SportMedBC.com and a couple of social media channels that we're on as well. Facebook.com/SportMedBC, Twitter.com/SportMedBC, as well as our YouTube channel. And you can find us, SportMedBC. Our next webinar will be in a month's time. Stay tuned for details on that. And be sure to check back for information and updates through our website and our various social media channels. For Paul Dwyer, I'm Mike Martinego. Thanks again for checking us out. That was a SportMed Safety webinar.